This is a strategic disaster. Harry, you can't preach about how you're giving your children space out of the public eye while your wife has just posted another picture of them, photoshopped to sell a candle named after them, while also revealing a full-on face shot of the child as a baby. So you can't preach when you're doing the exact thing you claim to be so bad.
Here's the deal. I am not mad at any photoshopping because, as we've seen already, Meghan is completely inauthentic. Her only authenticity is in her inauthenticity, if you will.
These pictures, which all appear to be artificially altered in some ways, this is just what we expect from you.
Nobody expected Archie's birthday to turn into a full-blown royal family controversy. But that's exactly what just happened. What should have been a simple family celebration has now sparked accusations of hypocrisy, manipulation, and a carefully planned media strategy involving Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and one man who says he's been warning everyone for years, Thomas Markle. The internet exploded after Meghan posted new birthday photos of Archie online. Within hours, viewers began spotting strange details in the images, questioning whether parts of the photos had been digitally altered. But the real shock came when people noticed the timing. Reports claimed products connected to Archie's birthday were allegedly being promoted at the exact same moment the photos went live, instantly triggering backlash across social media. Now critics are asking a brutal question. Are Harry and Meghan doing the exact thing they once accused the royal family of doing? Turning private family moments into public content? Meanwhile, Thomas Markle is reportedly still sitting alone in Mexico, watching his grandson grow up through headlines and Instagram posts like everyone else. And after 7 years of silence, many people now believe this birthday controversy may have exposed far more than Harry and Meghan ever expected. The internet rarely agrees on anything, but when it comes to this latest royal family controversy, the reaction has been explosive, divided, and unusually intense. What started as a simple birthday celebration for Archie has now spiraled into a global conversation about privacy, publicity, and what critics are calling a carefully controlled public image strategy involving Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and the long-standing claims made by Thomas Markle. According to critics online, this might not be the first time these questions have been raised, because within hours of Archie's birthday photos appearing online, the conversation didn't stay innocent for long. At first, fans reacted the way you'd expect: birthday wishes, supportive comments, celebration posts. But almost immediately, a second wave began forming underneath the surface. A wave of suspicion, a wave of analysis, a wave of people slowing down every image, zooming in, and asking a question that completely shifted the tone. Why does something so simple feel so staged? Now, to be clear, there is no confirmed evidence behind many of these claims. But that hasn't stopped the internet from doing what it does best: building narratives from patterns, timing, and perception. And the timing is exactly where things started to fall apart. Because just as the birthday photos went live, social media accounts and commentary pages began pointing out what they called strange coincidences. Some users claimed the images appeared unusually polished for casual family snapshots. Others suggested certain visual inconsistencies could indicate digital enhancement or post-production editing. None of these claims have been verified, but they spread rapidly. And once they did, the narrative began to shift away from celebration and toward controversy. But the real turning point wasn't the photos themselves. It was what came next. Reports circulating online suggested that merchandise or branding connected to the family's public image was allegedly being promoted around the same time frame as Archie's birthday posts. Again, these claims remain unverified, but they were enough to ignite a firestorm of criticism across social media platforms. And suddenly, the conversation was no longer about a birthday. It was about intent. Critics began asking whether the timing was purely coincidental or whether it reflected something more calculated, a coordinated approach to maintaining visibility, engagement, and public relevance even during personal family moments. That's where the backlash intensified. Because for years, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry have emphasized the importance of privacy, particularly when it comes to their children. They have spoken publicly about protecting Archie and Lilibet from media exposure, from intrusive press coverage, and from the pressures of royal publicity. But critics argue there is a contradiction at the center of this story. On one hand, they say they want privacy. On the other hand, major life moments still appear on global platforms, often accompanied by curated visuals, controlled messaging, and carefully timed releases. And that contradiction, whether real or perceived, is exactly what fuels this ongoing debate. Because once that idea takes hold, every detail becomes suspicious. Every photo becomes symbolic. Every post becomes a possible message. And every timing choice becomes a question mark. But the conversation took a more emotional turn when people brought Thomas Markle back into the narrative. For years, he has claimed he has been completely cut off from his grandchildren. No visits, no private calls, no direct connection to Archie or Lilibet. According to his public statements, his knowledge of their lives comes only through media coverage, the same way the general public sees it. That detail alone has always carried emotional weight in royal commentary spaces. But now, in the context of this latest controversy, it has been amplified again, because critics are framing it as part of a larger emotional contrast. A grandfather in Mexico, reportedly isolated from family life, versus a global celebrity household managing some of the most visible private-public boundaries in modern media. And that contrast is powerful, not necessarily because it proves anything, but because it creates a narrative tension that audiences instinctively respond to. Still, supporters of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry argue that much of this discussion crosses into speculation. They point out that social media often distorts timing, misinterprets coincidences, and amplifies assumptions into evidence without any factual basis. From this perspective, what looks like a coordinated strategy to critics may simply be routine public communication in a highly scrutinized environment. But that explanation hasn't slowed the narrative down. If anything, it has intensified it, because now the debate is no longer just about what happened. It's about what people believe is happening behind the scenes. And that's where this story becomes emotionally charged. As the comment sections filled up, one phrase began appearing repeatedly. This doesn't feel accidental. Another common sentiment was even sharper. They always say privacy, but everything still goes public. These reactions are important, not because they prove anything, but because they show how quickly perception can evolve in real time. Within hours, a birthday post transformed into a broader cultural argument about celebrity branding, family storytelling, and the boundaries between personal life and public consumption. And once a narrative reaches that stage, it becomes very difficult to contain, because every new detail, no matter how small, gets pulled into the same framework. A photo isn't just a photo anymore. A caption isn't just a caption. A timing choice isn't just timing. It becomes part of a larger story people are already building in their minds. And that is exactly why this situation has escalated so quickly. At this point, critics are not just reacting to what they see. They are interpreting everything through a lens of suspicion, pattern recognition, and emotional framing. Meanwhile, supporters are pushing back, arguing that the entire discussion is being fueled by online exaggeration and recycled talking points that ignore context. So what we're left with is a deeply divided narrative. One side sees careful control and strategic communication. The other sees normal family behavior being unfairly scrutinized. And standing in the middle of all this is a child's birthday that somehow became the center of a global debate. But this is only the beginning. Because as more details continue to circulate online, the questions are not slowing down. They are multiplying. As the debate around Archie's birthday continues to grow online, the conversation has now shifted away from just photos and timing and moved into something much deeper, much more emotional, and far more controversial. Because once the internet starts connecting dots, it rarely stops at the surface level. Now, old interviews, past statements, and long-standing family tensions are being pulled back into the spotlight, especially anything involving Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and Thomas Markle. And suddenly, what looked like a single birthday controversy is starting to feel like part of a much larger story that has been building for years. A story about trust, about distance, and about two completely different versions of reality. On one side, supporters of Meghan, Markle and Prince Harry argue that the couple has been consistent in one major message. They want privacy, protection, and control over their children's exposure to the public eye. They point to multiple interviews where they describe the pressure of media attention and the emotional toll of constant scrutiny. From their perspective, every public post is carefully measured, not for publicity, but for protection. A controlled way of sharing small moments without exposing their children to the full force of global media attention. But critics see it very differently. Because when you zoom out and look at the timeline of events over the years, a different narrative begins to form, at least in the eyes of online commentators. They argue that instead of privacy, what actually exists is a carefully managed public image system, one that selectively releases personal moments at specific times, often in ways that generate maximum engagement, sympathy, or global attention. And that is where the accusations begin to intensify. Not because there is confirmed proof, but because perception fills the gaps where evidence is missing. And perception is powerful, especially in celebrity culture. This is exactly why older statements from Thomas Markle are now resurfacing across social media platforms. For years, he has publicly expressed frustration about being excluded from his grandchildren's lives. He has claimed that major milestones happen without his knowledge and that he learns about them through public channels rather than direct communication. Whether people agree with him or not, those claims have always added emotional weight to the broader narrative because they introduce a human element that feels personal, painful, and unresolved. And now, in the context of the birthday controversy, those old statements are being reinterpreted through a new lens. Some online commentators are asking, if he's truly been cut off, why does the public only see carefully curated updates? Others push back, saying the situation is far more complex than social media allows, involving legal, emotional, and relational boundaries that outsiders cannot fully understand. But again, the internet is not always interested in complexity. It prefers clarity. And right now, clarity is being shaped by emotion. As more clips and past interviews resurfaced, another theme began gaining traction online: the idea of authenticity versus performance. Critics argue that over the years, the public image of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry has become increasingly curated. They point to carefully produced media appearances, structured interviews, and high-quality public messaging as evidence of a controlled narrative. They say, if it's all private, why does it still look like a campaign? Supporters respond that in today's media environment, nothing escapes production value. Every public figure, whether royal, political, or entertainment-based, manages their image through strategic communication. From that perspective, what critics call performance may simply be professionalism in a digital age. But the emotional tension comes from the fact that both arguments can sound plausible depending on how you interpret them. And that ambiguity is exactly what keeps this story alive. Because the moment people stop agreeing on what is normal, everything becomes questionable. Even simple family moments, even birthday posts, even silence. And that brings us back to the center of the controversy. The birthday itself. What should have been a private family celebration has now become symbolic. Not because of what was explicitly said or done, but because of what people believe is being implied. Critics claim the timing of posts, public reactions, and alleged promotional activity surrounding the same period creates a pattern that cannot be ignored. They argue that it reflects a larger system where personal milestones are intertwined with public visibility strategies. Supporters, however, insist this interpretation is misleading and unfair. They argue that coincidences are being reframed as evidence, and that online communities are constructing narratives that confirm their existing biases rather than objectively analyzing events. And this is where the psychological layer of the story becomes important. Because once a narrative becomes emotionally charged, people stop asking, what actually happened? And start asking, what does this mean? That shift is subtle but powerful. It transforms information into interpretation, and interpretation into belief. That's why every new detail in this story gets absorbed into the same framework. A photo isn't just a photo. A timing coincidence isn't just coincidence. A public statement isn't just communication. It becomes part of a larger emotional puzzle that people feel compelled to solve. And in the middle of all this interpretation stands Thomas Markle, a figure who, fairly or not, has become a symbolic reference point in the debate. To critics, he represents unresolved truth, a voice that was ignored, and a perspective that was dismissed. To supporters, he represents a complicated family dynamic that cannot be reduced to public soundbites or viral commentary clips. Both interpretations exist simultaneously online, and neither side is willing to fully concede, which is exactly why the controversy continues to grow instead of fading. Because there is no single agreed-upon version of reality here. Only competing narratives shaped by emotion, media framing, and personal belief. As the discussion escalates, another layer begins forming in the background, the idea of legacy. Not just how this moment is perceived today, but how it will be remembered years from now. Critics speculate about how Archie and Lilibet might one day view their own childhood narratives online. They raise concerns about digital footprints, public documentation, and how early life exposure to media narratives can shape identity later in life. Supporters counter that those fears are exaggerated and that modern families, especially high-profile ones, already navigate public visibility in responsible ways. But again, this debate is not just about facts. It is about fear, perception, and interpretation. And that combination is what keeps audiences emotionally locked in. Because every perspective feels like it might contain a piece of truth, but no one can agree on which piece matters most. And as long as that remains unresolved, the story continues to evolve. By this point in the story, the conversation around Archie's birthday is no longer just about photos, timing, or online speculation. It has evolved into something much larger, a full-scale cultural debate about privacy, power, media control, and long-term family fallout involving Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and Thomas Markle. And as the narrative reaches its peak intensity, the tone online becomes sharper, more emotional, and increasingly divided. Because now, people aren't just reacting to events. They're choosing sides. And once that happens, every detail becomes a weapon for interpretation. On one side, critics argue that the entire situation reflects a long-standing pattern of contradiction. They claim that while Meghan Markle and Prince Harry publicly emphasize privacy, boundaries, and protection from media intrusion, their actions still generate global headlines, viral moments, and carefully timed public narratives. To them, this is not coincidence. It is strategy. They point to the structured nature of public communications, the timing of major announcements, and the polished presentation of family moments as evidence that nothing is truly random. Even something as simple as a birthday photo, they argue, becomes part of a larger media ecosystem designed to maintain relevance and control the narrative. But supporters strongly reject this interpretation. They argue that critics are confusing visibility with intention. In a world where every public figure is constantly scrutinized, even minimal sharing becomes amplified into something larger than it is. From their perspective, what critics label as strategy is simply modern communication, managed, careful, and necessary in a digital age where misinformation spreads instantly. And this disagreement is where the conflict deepens. Because both sides are no longer just discussing facts. They are interpreting meaning. And meaning is where the real battle begins. At the center of this emotional divide remains Thomas Markle, a figure who has, over time, become symbolic rather than just personal in this discussion. For critics, he represents a voice of grievance that they believe has been overlooked or dismissed. His repeated claims of estrangement from his grandchildren are used as emotional evidence that something within the family structure is unresolved, fractured, and far more complex than public statements suggest. For supporters, however, he represents something entirely different. A deeply complicated family dynamic that has been played out in public, often without the full context, and frequently reduced to headlines that strip away nuance. And this is exactly where the emotional tension intensifies. Because in most online debates, nuance does not survive for long. Emotion takes over. And once emotion dominates, every new development gets interpreted through the same existing belief system. This is why the birthday controversy didn't fade. Instead, it expanded. It became a lens through which people re-examined everything that came before it. Past interviews, old statements, public appearances, media coverage, even silence itself became meaningful. And in that environment, nothing is neutral anymore. A post is not just a post. A photo is not just a photo. A silence is not just silence. Everything becomes part of a larger perceived pattern. And that pattern is what keeps audiences engaged. But as the debate escalates, a deeper question begins to emerge. One that goes beyond any single family, any one birthday, or any viral moment. It is the question of legacy. What does it mean for a child to grow up in a world where their earliest memories are already public content? What does it mean when childhood moments are archived, analyzed, and debated by millions of strangers? And how does that shape identity in the long run? Critics raise concerns that Archie and Lilibet's digital footprints are being created before they even have the ability to understand them. They argue that every public image contributes to a permanent narrative that will follow them into adulthood, whether they choose it or not. Supporters counter that this is an unavoidable reality for any child born into a high-profile family. They argue that controlled sharing is actually more protective than total silence, because it allows parents to set boundaries on their own terms rather than letting external media define the narrative entirely. But again, there is no consensus, only competing interpretations. And competing interpretations are what keep this story alive far beyond its original moment. Because the internet does not resolve emotional stories quickly. It amplifies them. It replays them, it reframes them, and it attaches meaning to every new detail that appears. That is exactly why this controversy continues to resurface in cycles, each time adding new layers, new arguments, and new emotional weight. And now, as the discussion reaches its final phase, attention turns toward consequence. Not just what happened, but what happens next. Because once a family narrative becomes public property, it rarely returns to private space unchanged. Critics warn that continued public exposure will only deepen the divide, making reconciliation harder and turning private family tension into permanent public discourse. Supporters, on the other hand, argue that ongoing public engagement is simply part of modern life for high-profile individuals, and that criticism is often exaggerated by online communities seeking patterns where none exist. But regardless of which side people take, one thing is clear. This story is no longer just about one birthday. It is about perception itself. And perception, once shaped, is incredibly difficult to reverse. That is why every new post, every interview, every public appearance, and every silence will continue to be analyzed through the same lens that was formed during this controversy. And that lens is already polarized. Some see control. Some see coincidence. Some see strategy. Some see normal life under extreme scrutiny. But almost no one sees it as simple anymore. And that complexity is what ensures this narrative will continue long after this specific moment fade from trending topics. Because stories like this do not end cleanly. They evolve. They resurface. And they attach themselves to every future event that feels even remotely connected. So as this chapter closes, the underlying tension remains unresolved. The questions are still hanging. The interpretations are still competing. An emotional divide is still widening. And perhaps the most important realization of all is this. In a modern media landscape, truth is no longer just about what happened. It is about what people believe happened. And that belief is what drives everything forward. Before you click away, think about how quickly this story escalated from a simple birthday post to a global debate about privacy, family tension, and public image. Because whether you believe this is just online speculation or something deeper unfolding behind the scenes, one thing is clear: The conversation around Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and Thomas Markle is not slowing down anytime soon. And that's exactly why you need to stay tuned. New details, new reactions, and new angles are still emerging, and every update seems to add another layer to an already complicated story. What people thought was just a family moment has turned into something much bigger, a discussion about trust, media control, and how public narratives are shaped in real time. So if you want to stay ahead of the next update, make sure you're subscribed because the next development in this story could change the entire direction of the conversation. Again, drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this is being blown out of proportion, or is there something more intentional happening behind all of this? Either way, this story isn't over yet, and the next chapter might be even more revealing than the last.